And thank you so much, Peter. Great discussion there, and Suleiman from NIDLP. Again, really looking at what's going on here, the possibilities. And I think when you listen to this, the possibilities, without a doubt, are endless. We're going to talk about more possibilities, and particularly in the supply chain, in just a couple of minutes now. We still have an action-packed afternoon for you, and we still have, a bit of an action-packed morning, so we're still not finished. We really have managed to get some great speakers and get everybody here to bring you up to date with what's going on in all areas of mining and minerals. And let me bring my panel up here. We're going to be talking about creating resilient mineral supply chains. So if I might get them coming up here. Mashari Al-Ali, the CEO of Golden Compass, joins us. Mashari, join me here in seat number 2. We're delighted to have with us the Managing Director for Fannin Global Advisories, Honourable Frank Fannin. Thank you so much. From Metzco Autotech, we have the President for Minerals, Marco Terras-Vassara. Lovely to see you. Jock O'Rourke is the President and CEO of the Mosaic Company, and Sonia Scarselli is the Vice President from BHP Explorer. So thank you all so much. We have a great panel here, and we're going to be looking at supply chain resilience in minerals and integration, processing in the region and indeed beyond. And Mashari, if I might talk to you and start you off. In your role as a consultancy, you're really looking at a broad range here. Where do you see, when it comes to supply chain, the greatest, I suppose, the bottleneck and the need? What needs to happen right now?
First of all, I would like to thank you and thank all the gentlemen here. The supply chain, as you know, it's the bottleneck right now, especially with the political situations globally, and also with the high demand that Saudi Arabia has. With the Giga project that Saudi running right now in the north, and BIF as well, and the highest demand, the high demand of mining sector, especially right now that Saudi Arabia industrial mineral resource issue more than 300 exploration licenses this year. That will leading for a huge of demand, and that will create a lack of supply chain. If you are looking at it right now to all the suppliers in Saudi Arabia, you will find the lack of that because of the global situations. Yes.
And perhaps to bring us up to date on the global situation, no better man here than Frank Fannin. Frank, we look at the European Union, North Africa, and different patterns of trade. Do you think there's a need, I suppose, for a new supply chain? And what can this region do? I mean, when you look at, the West at the moment, does it lack the minerals? I don't know, does it lack the intellectual capacity, the capital, or does it just lack political will, perhaps? I mean, what's gone wrong? And how do we maybe not fix it, but change it?
Yeah, thank you. It's great to be back here again. I spoke at the first forum, and the second one is just such a great success and achievement. I would say that first, going back to first principles, we're having to look at the supply chain in a completely new way. Coming out of COVID, the COVID experience, which we all saw, really strained our traditional supply chains. The war on Ukraine effectively broke them. And continuing hostilities between the US, Europe, China, ensures that they're in terminal decline. So everything is being reoriented, which has driven a new sense of industrial policy in the US and Europe and other places. So everything's being recreated. The question, you posed an important one. We just, in the US, passed a historic bill, the Inflation Reduction Act, which provided lots of carrots to incent the development of clean energy technologies, including mining in the United States. However, it's not the matter of, which you touched on, the lack of intellectual capacity or industrial capacity. It is that issue of political will and the failure to have a real meaningful ability to permit things with any degree of certainty is going to be the most considerable constraint for the US, but I would say the West more generally, in achieving the policy-induced energy transitions that they've been calling for.
And we'll talk a little bit more about that, but it sort of leaves things at a bit of a stalemate and standstill, which is not good for for anybody. Marco, when we look at, looking at your company, Finland-based, but a global reach, and I suppose we look at the shift in supply chains moving a little more regionally as well. But of course, the big focus on CO2 reduction, that actually has to happen. How do you see that, I suppose, regional supply chain shift? How is that helping, or is it?
Yeah, definitely it is. And of course, the points that Frank mentioned are very valid, these geopolitical issues, but there's another incentive for us as well. We are supplying very heavy components from all over the world to different locations.
Yeah, I want to get into the specifics of that later, but...
Yeah, and it is definitely affecting. So basically, by regionalizing, you can avoid a lot of logistics, which then saves in CO2 emissions in longer term. So we have very high ambitions on reducing the CO2, being net zero from own operations by 2030, and reducing 20% from the logistics CO2. And of course, regionalization of our own manufacturing plays a very important role in that.
Jock, talk to me about how you think Saudi Arabia can actually play a role in the wider global supply chain. I mean, are they essential to this? And again, how interconnected are they?
Well, certainly in our industry, which is the crop nutrient fertilizer industry, Saudi starts with a great advantage of having, vast natural resources. But more importantly, I think what Saudi has done that I think is so important, what the kingdom has done, is they've invested in things like the Saudi Arabian rail system to allow access to the interior of the country, to bring the products to the coast. So the combination of resources, a great educational system, and good infrastructure allows Saudi to be the kingdom to be a great player in the global supply chain. And I know it goes a lot further than just ours, but now they're starting to evolve into more manufacturing. And I think the use of those and building the manufacturing will really accelerate them to that 2030 vision.
And that infrastructure, vitally important in terms of...
Critical. I mean, that's one of the reasons I think that the supply chain failed in COVID, was because of the lack of infrastructure in so many countries.
Sonia, we look at so many dynamics in the market. We've been talking about them for the last day and a half now. I mean, particularly for the major players in the market, what would you say are the main supply chain constraints and challenges right now?
So if we think about the energy transition context and we think about the need of critical resources to really enable the commitment for 2050, one of the key aspects is supply those resources to the market is the beginning of the value chain. And what we're facing today, it's I wouldn't say lack of focus, but it is a reminder that to find, develop, and produce those critical resources, it takes and requires time and effort. So one of the key challenges is on the front end of the resource value chain, finding them and then bringing to the market. And in terms of amount that is required for the energy transition, we're looking at a massive difference compared to what was needed till today. So for example, copper, we will require twice the amount than what is needed today. Nickel, 3 times the amount. And that's even thinking with the growth of population. So that is on the forefront of our key piece of work going forward, especially on the mining industry.
Frank, if I might come to you, because one area I think that's really important that we need to look at when it comes to supply chain, and governments and businesses particularly are going to look at political risk when it comes to looking at countries. Now, your time at the US State Department, you were certainly looking at political risk in very many countries. How does the political risk in the kingdom here today look compared to what it did many years ago? And, what do you look for? What is everybody else out there looking for when it comes to political risk?
Yeah, it's a critical question. When I was at the State Department, one of the initiatives I created was understanding, and prior to that I worked in the resource industry. So I had a keen understanding of why companies would not go to certain regions or certain countries, and then who was willing to go to those places. And from a geopolitical national security perspective, that created a vacuum because companies were an extension of America and the values. And so by not having US companies in different parts of the world, it created a significant constraint on values-based diplomacy. So we wanted to dispel that. And so some of those initiatives are ongoing. Now, what's included in that are things like, why do companies not want to engage with certain countries? What are the issues? Corruption, a high degree of corruption, lack of environmental protections, environmental standards, failure to recognize human rights and commit to labor kind of protections, permit certainty, regulatory certainty, extent of government take, the prevention, do we have a sense of confidence that the government policy will be consistent? And Sonia mentioned mining projects take a long time. So is there that degree of continuity across government? And so try to change that. And I think when it comes to Saudi Arabia, you start looking at the notion of these criteria for political risk, and it favors the kingdom. You have certainty. You have a government that has the political will to make meaningful change and do it quickly, even though the mining projects take a long time. All of those elements, Jacques was, there's a discussion about infrastructure. There's a commitment to that. So I think it's quite a significant contrast to other areas, and I think it's really moving forward.
Jacques, we were briefly talking about this too, and you were even saying how maybe we need to redefine what is political risk, because right. I think we all look at it as the shock horror, initially, but there's a lot more involved. How do we unpack that sort of speak?
So, from my perspective, I mean, every country has political risk. I live and work in the United States. Permitting in the United States is an incredible challenge. So even sustaining our business in the United States becomes a challenge. So when you think about political risk, you do have to think about all those things. What is the risk of corruption? What is the risk of changing policy? But also, what is the risk of not being able to sustain your business because of the political environment that you're in? And whether that is, because of bureaucracy or whether that's because of lack of will of government, it all amounts to the same thing. So, we do business in a lot of areas, and each one has unique, different political risks.
Yeah, and indeed, I think also we're seeing, I suppose, the short-term attitude of many governments in the West too, that things are just not politically correct to talk about right now, so there will be no support for possibly mining anything in hydrocarbons, a lot of things like that. So it's causing other social problems, while that comes at a stalemate. Mishai, I see you were agreeing with Frank there or nodding while he was talking. Talk to me about where you see that concept of political risk.
Actually, the political risk, as Mr. Frank has mentioned, is some of the countries, they are working very hard to reduce the political risk effectively. Saudi Arabia, they are doing a great job in the last 10 years, especially in the mining sectors. They already established a new strategic for mining, and they are identifying many of the risks that it will affect to implement this strategy. And one of the reasons, as Jacques said, is the infrastructures. The infrastructures, they are working very hard to increase the capacity of the seaboards and also of the roads as well. Like what we are seeing a very good example that they are developed at Duwaihi and the Souk and the Mansoura Masarra mines. They already supply and bring waters for 600 kilometers from city by using the sustainable waters, swage waters. So they are working very hard to develop this type of things, and that will be efficient. Recently, it will be in the end to develop this rank. Yeah.
Thank you for that. Marco, come back to some of the work that you're doing. As a main supplier in terms of the mining equipment, you briefly touched on it there. And really, we look at resilient operations and we look at, how do we get resilient minerals. But what kind of new innovation is actually changing the landscape, and particularly in what you're doing right now?
what I, of course, relate to the topic of sustainable supply chain, would like to take up an example on our circularity innovation. Basically, in the metals value chain, grinding is the place where you consume most of the energy, but also where a lot of wear and tear happens. And quite a long time there has been a practice of disposing that waste, that wear material to landfills and waste bins, because there has not been means in separating rubber from casted iron. Now we have actually, through an innovation, we can do it economically viable and doing that as a service to our clients so that they don't have to do it. We can avoid putting hundreds of thousands of tons waste to landfills, which can be reprocessed and reused in the same application. So I think that is really playing into the theme of sustainable supply chain.
And it's very important to hear that, and I think encouraging to, to see that some major players like yourself are actually adapting to something very radically different in many ways. But that's what has to happen as well, though, I think, and not just, your company, but, companies in this country, companies in anybody involved in the mining area.
Yeah, absolutely. So in everything we do, I think in all the new product developments, sustainability is number one criteria. So that is the first thing we look at. And of course, that is not only in the product development, but this all operation throughout the logistics, manufacturing, everything we do today is looked upon through these sustainability eyes.
Sonia, when we look, you just mentioned how, the resources that are here at the moment are, by no means enough to fulfill the demand that we're going to see. But how can you actually meet that projected demand, and particularly when we look at future-facing commodities, copper and nickel? Talk to us a little bit about what are the plans in place?
Yes, for us, we've been looking at different ways where we can simulate, especially the front end of the life cycle, of the exploration part. We are currently having our own internal exploration, business development. Those are the more traditional tools that we've been leveraging. But recently, we have created a new program. It's an accelerator program, which is BHP Explorer. And the intent of this program is to invest on early stage exploration companies and startups and juniors. They are looking at those resources. And so the way we're doing it, we help them to build around their concept and their ideas. We accelerate their business and their exploration plans and finance and support them to actually go in the field and test those opportunities. What that allows is to reduce the time from the exploration phase. I talked about the 15-20 years from exploration to production, and of that chunk of time, 5-7 years is just the exploration phase. So we can actually accelerate that phase to cut the time in half or even less, which is actually very important. But we also can help those companies to set up those activities in a way that it will be much easier on a success case to develop and produce. So as a tool, it definitely helps us to recognize opportunity globally. Actually, on that, I might wanted to add a little bit on the conversation that we had around the different jurisdiction, above ground risk. And I do agree with the comment around above ground risk is very different and is not anymore to be used the same way we used in the past. Yes. It really changed a lot, and it's changed in terms of regulation, legislation, change on political sentiment, but also the public opinion that is having a big impact on our ability to do operations. And so that's something that is going to definitely be an unlocker and an enabler for the mining industry going forward.
Now, Meshari, you deal a lot with them. Some of the juniors in the industry. We talked to some of them yesterday, and we had a finance panel as well talking about some of the issues and indeed the complications in getting finance.
That's right.
There are some ways and some incentives, without a doubt. There was mention of maybe eventually a secondary market on the stock exchange. I don't think we're there yet here.
Yes.
But what are the ways that you can actually, because this demand has to be met, and there is a sense of urgency as well.
That's right, that's right. Many junior companies, in the meantime, they are working very hard to get the finance. We saw that recently here in Saudi Arabia, but it's a best practice. I believe it will be start as we are Saudi Arabia. They are just launched more than 300 licenses this year and 225 licenses last year. I believe the total it will be 500 licenses. That will be create a very good potential for the market in the near futures. And there is a very good program that has been launched recently in the last 5 years through SIDF. SIDF now they are supporting the junior mining company, especially in the last stage of exploration. And one of their initiatives, as you know, that to support the existing mining companies to expand more and more through building and providing good loans with no profits. All of that will create a potential, high potential in the futures for market exchange, I believe.
Yeah, and we talked to the SIDF the last time. I even heard from them here.
That's right.
Some great initiatives going on there.
That's
Frank, if I might talk to you about the importance of transparency in the supply chain and how important that is. You know, clearly everybody wants to make sure that scope 1, 2, and 3 are being managed, but how can the region here, you know, provide enough transparency, I suppose, to satisfy country demand and to satisfy customers?
Yeah, it's a huge topic, and the answers are still being thought over right now. I think, you know, what we have is this energy transition as it's talked about, or energy transformation, and this one's unique because typically we've had multiple energy transitions over in history, but those were all based on technology. A new technology was adopted. And then it was utilized because it was more energy efficient, more energy dense, it was easier to transport, more readily able to scale. And so publics adopted it. And then governments came in to regulate it after. This energy transition is exactly the opposite. The policy is driving a transition to go off of a fossil-based economy to a non-fossil-based economy. Policymakers want to do this quickly. Mining, which is the critical element, takes a long time. How is this all going to reconcile itself? So we went from a technology-induced transition to a policy-induced transition, and this one is also being constrained by geopolitical considerations and ESG. And so what does that mean going forward? And the transparency is a part of that ESG criteria. So I think that, you know, a place that's starting fresh is able to approach this in a way that doesn't have some of the traditional kind of entanglements of other relationships, geopolitical entanglements, and they can start with a fresh slate. I mean, and Sonia talked about some of the challenges, and we talked about permitting and how to actually get things done. There's that back to the issue of political will, and because you're doing it from a blank slate, everyone can have confidence. And I think having the integration of that vertical supply chain, and of course the kingdom is a big proponent of Lucid Motors, for example. There's going to be an increasing call from the global publics who are calling for this energy transition to ensure that the processing and the production of those inputs are done in a way that meets these ESG criteria.
And Jock, I mean, it's very important, I think, that we make sure whatever is done now is done sustainably. I don't think there's any discussion around that or any real disagreement. But when we look at what's happening here in the kingdom, and also the push to become an industrial leader, and again, looking at, I suppose, managing or helping feeding the global, to become a global supply hub, so to speak. You know, again, what can the kingdom do to make sure it does that sustainably?
You know, first of all, I think we talk about the Middle East. I mean, Saudi Arabia is in a perfect location to serve Asia, Middle East, Africa. And, you know, I mean, it starts there from a supply chain. If anything we can do to shorten the supply chains are going to be helpful. So as a hub, you know, and the government is doing great things here. The kingdom has done great things. For instance, at Ras Al Khaimah, building a deep sea port at Ras Al Khaimah, which allows the export and the import of, you know, what the materials you do need. again, building an industrial hub where you have the contractors, you have the maintenance, you have all of the things you need in one spot allows you to take on a bigger role. And then I think the other thing that maybe gets missed a little bit in this is the access to financing, that the government is dedicated to really putting the money and the investments into building that supply chain. And as we talk about the agricultural supply chain, it all ends in countries which you're really trying to feed people. And the other aspect of it is the new products. If you think about the pressure on nickel and copper, it's equal in agricultural products, and maybe even worse in some respects, because you have, in the transition to energy, you have things like ethanol being used for fuel, you have biodiesel, and so that is not only increasing the demand in the short term, but increasing the demand overall. And now you're starting to see lithium iron phosphate batteries take up even more. So, taking advantage of these resources and building the next generation of products, I think, is where Saudi Arabia could really become the global hub certainly for this region. And there's no other country that's as well endowed to do that.
And Sonia, when we look at, that increased supply that is needed, we heard from BHP the bigger picture, but talk to us a little bit about the role of BHP Explorer.
Yes, from our side is the first part is to identify the opportunity globally. So part of the program is to look at these companies. They are everywhere, and so this has been very exciting. But also it adds some challenges on working in different jurisdictions with different regulatory approval and system. But once we overcome that, what we're looking at is really discovering new resources that we can bring to the market much faster than what we've done in the past. And being there at the front end of the exploration of what it does allow to put around any of the new mine the right framework for the development and the production, whether it is the environmental framework, the safety framework, and so on. So the program itself will allow to accelerate those resources. Hopefully, instead of taking 15 to 20 years, we can cut some of that time quite significantly.
Marco, talk to us a little bit more specifics, particularly when it comes to foundries. Huge energy consumption going on there. Do you envisage that you can actually turn a foundry, can you turn that green?
Yeah, you can turn that green, and of course, in an effort, there's many ways of doing it, and you need to do multiple actions. Of course, finding ways to reduce the consumption is one thing, but then what we have been doing now is that transferring them to use green energy. So basically, you apply wind, you apply solar in terms of supplying those energies, and again, we are backing to circularity and recycling the products. For example, the foundry sand, which is a scary result, often needs to be transported thousands and thousands of kilometers. So when you clean that and reuse it, that you again avoid a lot of CO2 emissions. So there are many ways you can do in your own operations to be more sustainable, and of course that's what we are trying to do.
And again, that's some of the work you're doing, but how many other foundries around the world are moving in that direction at the moment?
I think we all have to. That I can only speak for our company, but I think today what is good today, as I feel it, that these environmental issues many times in the past were driven by legislation only, but now there's actually a financial incentive to do it, and that has changed it completely. So I believe that many other companies are looking doing exactly the same things that we are doing.
Jock, talk to me about the demand for phosphate, and again, it's increasing every year in your work here with the Ma'aden Wa'id Al Shamal phosphate company. Can this country also, you think, become a leader in global phosphates and really a contributor, I suppose, to the global food security as well?
Yeah. Well, and I think the phosphate's just been put on the U.S. critical materials list. So, I think it's recognized throughout the world that if population's going to grow, if the standard of living and less hunger is going to occur, you need to have those critical elements that are part of growing plant and human life. So phosphates will continue to grow as long as standard of living continues to grow and population continues to grow. The northern part of Saudi Arabia has fantastic reserves of phosphate, and now with the MPC, Modern Phosphate Company, and our Wad Al Shamal that we're involved with Modern, we're seeing the country develop those resources to supply the world. And if you think about it as a non-renewable resource, those long-term, high-quality reserves are going to be around, and much like the wealth that was created through oil in this country, you're going to see the same thing from mineral resources. And then the challenge is, the 2030 challenge is, how do you use those to become a more sophisticated society, if you will, move those into downstream things. And I think they're doing that with things like Lucid Motors, where they're getting into batteries. And batteries will be, I think, phosphates, iron, lithium batteries will be the future of at least stationary batteries, maybe not for cars, but stationary batteries will likely take over from the nickel cadmium batteries because of the expense. And so time means that phosphates are going to be more critical. This country, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, has incredible resources. It's a pretty natural fit.
Frank, if you would pick up on that and also come back to what you talked about, Saudi, I suppose, having the blank slate, that sort of clean canvas in terms of being able to start so many things. Is that, I would imagine, very much to its advantage?
Absolutely. It's because they're able to mobilize. We talked about it's a contrast of political will. What we talked about, what's talking about in Europe and in North America, where governments say they want to do have an end state, but actually to take on constituencies to achieve that end state can be very challenging. And part of that is historic in terms of the way in which the competing interests have aligned themselves over time. I mean, just an example, the state of Massachusetts wanted to have a renewables plan for their electricity grid. And they said they wanted green power, so they cut a deal with Quebec to bring hydropower down. And the state of Maine, environmental groups sued and blocked the development of the transmission line. And environmental groups sued to block the transmission line to bring carbon-free power to the state of Massachusetts. So this is just a practical example of how are we going to achieve some of this ambition when there's these competing constituencies. You must do it at scale, as Sonia was speaking about. The scale is just absolutely remarkable. So a place like Saudi Arabia, who's looking at this energy transition from that ground up, and they have, of course, the political will, they have the capital, they have the infrastructure, but because they're beginning from anew, they have a reduced level of that kind of competing constituencies. And so I'm confident that they can achieve the degree of ambition reasonably quickly relative to other parts of the world where to build something is quite controversial in many parts of the West.
Sonia, if you can maybe look a little bit in terms of the regulatory environment, and what would you say are alternative ways to create resilient mineral supplies?
I think that is the main way. So for us, if you think about investment, we're going to invest on those projects that sit on jurisdiction where we can see transparency of the regulatory environment, we can see consistency, we can see also an approach that it lasts through time, is not volatile. That's where we're going to invest. We wanted to, on an investment that is 20, 30 years ahead, we want to make sure that those rules are consistent through time. It's fundamental. That's one aspect. The other piece, which I go back to a little bit what Frank just said on the white slate and what the kingdom has been doing and has done, to me that is a great example to create a system that is transparent, consistent, with a regulatory framework that actually we can quickly understand, we can see all the parts, and I would recommend to see something like that in other jurisdictions as well. It's a clear example on what we're looking at going forward. We definitely wanted to invest in different countries, but have to be investable. There has to be a system that allow us to see with the transparency that our investment is on the right place.
Mashari, when we look ahead, I suppose, and for you, looking ahead to, the next couple of years, let's maybe say a 5-year horizon. There's so much happening at the moment. There's so many dynamics at work right now. Where do you see the country really, I suppose, shining in terms of any particular area? What are you expecting?
If we are looking actually to the mining sector, particularly in the main times, and where it will be after 5 years, I believe with the strategy that has been implemented in the last 2 years, and with the high transparency that the ministry play right now, and the high communication, the effective communication between the private sector and also the governmental sectors, we believe the mining sector will play a big role in the next, especially right now with the Giga project that has been implemented in the up to the north, and also that with the industrial hub, as Jockey said, that the big international companies, they are really need the supply chain in support of doing maintenance and many other things related to the operating in the Saudi Arabia. That Saudi Arabia that has been implemented all of that based on the strategic that they already studied in the last 5 years, and they are working very hard. They already allocate a budget, a huge budget for that in the governmental budget, and they are working and sign many contractors with big international construction companies to do that things right now.
Now, Frank, you were here last year, and I mean, talking to some colleagues, I'm sure, while you're here this year, as you look to the future, what do you think in terms of the mining sector particularly? A few years out, where do you think we're going? And even within 1 year, what are you feeling in terms of the difference?
Yeah, I think the mining sector is going through its own state of innovation. I mean, the team that Sonia and the things that BHP is leading and what Sonia's leading, that's a new way of thinking about things, completely. And I think you're starting to see that all across the board. And one of the other things that is also interesting is that many of the energy transition metals in particular, they're being pursued and developed by smaller companies. The exploration traditionally is being done by smaller companies. It's analogous to the US shale revolution. The US shale revolution was not led by the majors. Yeah. It was led by independent small companies who had an entrepreneurial spirit, and they innovated, and they got after it, and eventually the bigger companies went and partnered and bought them. And so what Sonia's team is doing is kind of an inverse of that in a way. And I think that the entire mining industry is going through its own reorientation, partially because of some of the ESG considerations, but also because they have to do things differently to achieve the calls of society. And I think the kingdom is well placed to take advantage of that, given the blank slate we talked about, the level of investment, and this entrepreneurial mindset that's occurring in the kingdom is transformative.
We have to wrap this up now, I'm afraid, at the minute. Sonia, if there was to be, I suppose, a call to action that you would want to put out there, what would it be right now? I need about 30 seconds on this last.
Take the example of what has been done here in Saudi and take it as an example for other countries to bring the same level of rigor, transparency, and consistency across board.
Mashari, if we were looking, what's the big call to action? What do you need to make your life a bit easier here?
Actually, that to increase, related to the mining sector, I believe if we are increasing the process of the issuing the license, and also that to secure the fund for the junior mining companies, and also the increase that support from the Ministry of Industrial to build hubs as a mineral hubs, especially for exploration companies in the meantime. That will create, I believe, a big impact in the future.
And I think we're beginning to see that. Marco, again, I suppose a call to action if there is one. What needs to be done urgently?
I think seminars like this are very good because technologies exist, there are incentives, there's wish to change things. So I think more we can share information among each other, better we actually can then find the right way for the future. So I'm an optimist. I think with all these people gathered together, there is a lot of power to make change, and I believe it will happen, and it has to happen.
It happened, Jacques.
I think the big thing is continue with the bold vision, continue to build the hubs, because these hubs are, they're really where it all happens, the industrial hubs where you can bring the stuff together, continue to build the infrastructure. I think that's the way you're going to really accelerate the...
Frank, please take us out on that note of optimism. Add to that for us.
Inspire
us.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the future is quite bright, and what's being talked about, vision without execution is just a dream. And so what I'm seeing, and just from from last year to this year, is the focus on execution of ambition, not just talking about at the international fora, things that people have been talking about for a long time, but focusing on execution. The result shouldn't be a meeting, the result should be a deal, the result should be minerals coming out of the ground, the result should be manufacturing and deployment. And I see that happening, and I think it will happen more so around the world.
And again, I think that's so encouraging for all of the companies that are looking at this country and looking to come here. And I think, we've heard testimony to that in the last day and a half, without a doubt. I want to thank you all so much for your great input. A round of applause for our dear panel here. Ms. Shari, thank you so much. Frank, Marco, Jacques, and Sonia, thank you all so much.